Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we are finally doing the player ranking for Total Drama All-Stars. Obviously, everyone's favorite season of the show, and this was an interesting player ranking to put together, as there's a lot of people who I feel play pretty poorly and have pretty massive holes in their game, but we just have to roll with it. And obviously, with a lot of the character derailment going on in the season, it sort of made some people hard to talk about, but I just had to roll with it. But there are 14 players to talk about, and let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the list. So starting off at number 14, the player I believe played the worst game on Total Drama All-Stars is Lindsey. Obviously the first boot of the season, and I mean, what is there to say? She was so dumb that she couldn't even push a cart. And obviously, there wasn't really much going for her. I mean, everyone was pretty frustrated by her lack of intelligence early on, which again kind of speaks to the quality of the writing on All Stars. But again, just taking it at face value, it is a pretty bad game. Not too much to say here. And she's here at number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13, and we're actually going a bit further into the boot order. I mean, I did consider putting the second boot down here, but I figured this person played a slightly worse game. But here we have Sam. And obviously Sam was the most questionable all-star pick. Like, why was he on the season? But the main reason I have him this low is that I feel like he pretty much brought nothing to the table. It's sort of weird because he wasn't even the first boot from his team. He was able to at least survive a round, whereas there is someone that we will be talking about shortly that did not survive a round. However, even then, like, Sam didn't really have many allies in the game. There wasn't really much going for him staying. I mean, literally, after they win the first challenge, he is sent to exile to go. And he is someone who is largely seen as, like fodder. I mean, the reason he goes to Boney Island is because he didn't really participate in the challenge. And even beyond that, like, he doesn't really contribute much beyond that. Doesn't really do much to justify why he is on All Stars. And then we get to his boot episode, where the reason he's voted out is because he cheats in the challenge, where he was stuffing pancake stuff into his pants on the assumption that he was going to be sent back to Boney Island, which is a very weird assumption to make because yes, he is the most useless person there, and yes, he already went there, but it was pretty clear to the rest of his team that he just wasn't really cut out for Boney Island. I mean, he came back in pretty rough condition, and plus on top of that, like, Cameron had already been sent to Boney Island after him. So it's not even like he was the default option to go there. Like, it'd be one thing if he had gone there like twice in a row. The team was completely ignoring his health, and through that, he decided to do that on the assumption that he would just go there over and over. Like, yes, he had already been there, but so had Cameron from his own team. So it's sort of a weird, like, position for him to take, but whatever, he cheats in the challenge, he's voted out. So again, there just really isn't any pros for me to give to Sam other than him surviving a round. But I feel like the next person we'll be talking about does at least have a bit more going for them. So he's here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12, and we are going back to the second boot of the season. And here we have Lightning. And I considered putting Lightning in below Sam. I did think about it because he was technically the first person voted out on the villains team. He was sent to exile after winning the first challenge, was unable to find the Chris head, and again, he's voted out at the first opportunity. However, the reason he is voted out is a bit strange, where yes, he was annoying and he definitely got on a lot of people's nerves. However, we see Joe be the one to orchestrate his boot, not because he's annoying, but because he's too strong in challenges for whatever reason. And yes, he does kind of mess up on the challenge. However, Joe's the one to orchestrate his boot. And even the next episode, like, we see the villains once again struggling in the challenge to the point where Joe and Heather consider that maybe voting out Lightning was a mistake. So again, there is at least some merit to Lightning in the sense that he was an asset to his team to the point where even people are regretting voting him out. But at the end of the day, I can't have him too high. I mean, he was still voted out. Like, the fact that he was still targeted by Joe despite him being a challenge strength is a knock on his game. And even beyond that, like, I don't think really had much going for him. He, again, did get on a lot of people's nerves, and I don't really feel like he had a lot of potential moving forward. However, it's that little pro, the sense that, again, he wasn't voted out strictly due to being annoying, that leads to me putting him one spot higher at number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11, and we have the next boot of the season, and here we have Joe. And as I alluded to earlier, Joe was the main one to orchestrate the lightning vote at the first round, so there's that. However, she is in the bottom 2 at the first elimination ceremony, which isn't ideal, but she is able to get the votes there. Afterwards, sort of regrets the move. I mean, again, the main reason she votes out Lightning is because she sees him as being too strong in challenges, and again, rather than just simply being annoying. And she does have a bit of a relationship with Heather early on, but even then, it's not really enough to carry her through. And she's literally the next boot thereafter, largely due to her own actions in the challenge. She essentially just sabotages her team, like over and over again, to where she ends up being the boot there. So that's not great. And again, she is a third boot of the season. I can't have her too high, but to her credit, she does at least pull off a move, even if that move isn't necessarily great for her game. I mean, as I felt like Lightning would have been a target to have ahead of her moving forward, but it is enough to land her here at number 11. Now we're moving on to number 10, and these next two are pretty tough as they each have pretty big knocks against their game. However, at number 10, I decided to have the less actively bad knock, but also the knock that is probably more indicative of this player in general. And here we have Sierra. And the thing about Sierra is a lot of her season is defined by her relationship with Cody. I mean, and specifically her latching on to Cameron as a substitute for that. She obviously comes into the season separated from Cody, and it seemed like at first that maybe this would allow her to be a bit more independent and a bit more grounded. But then she quickly bonds with Cameron and starts to see enough similarities in him to where she starts to pretend that Cameron is Cody, which is pretty bad. It shows a level of delusion there. And obviously it's a knock in the sense that she annoys Cameron to the point where Cameron wants to vote her out. However, at least in World Tour, yes, that is a similar issue with her. At least in World Tour, she was actually obsessing over someone that was physically there. But here, like, it's not even that she likes Cameron that much, but Cameron just reminds her of Cody, and she's referring to him as if he is Cody, and that's not particularly great. But from there on out, she kind of just stumbles through the game. She doesn't really play a factor in any of the votes. She's in the bottom 2 at one point, and then eventually she is eliminated because the villains win the challenge and get to choose who to vote out there. And Cameron, who's on the team at that point, decides to go along with it. I mean, it also gets so bad that Cameron tries to quit the game just to get away from her, which is pretty bad as well. And there isn't really much to say about Sierra's game in general. I mean, she is technically the last person voted out before the merge, so I guess that's something, and the fact that she at least makes it that far. But it's just the level of delusion she shows throughout the season, plus the lack of pros that lead me to put her here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we have the highest ranked pre-merger left to talk about. And here we have Heather. And to be honest, I didn't want to put Heather this high, as she obviously has a pretty bad move towards the end of her run, but she does have some pros there that lead her to be a bit higher in this list. So obviously she starts on the villain tribe. It's not particularly great. Like, she does form a rivalry with Joe early on. The two of them butt heads quite a bit. And she is technically in danger at the Joe boot. However, she is able to get Gwen on her side and through that Duncan to vote with her. And as a result, she ends up staying there. That's pretty good. But a lot of her run is her, again, sort of scraping by. I mean, yes, there are easy targets there in Lightning and Joe. But after they're gone, I mean, she doesn't really have much room to maneuver. And plus, Alejandro, of all people, is determined to get her out, even at the expense of his own game, which we'll be talking about soon. And again, she is sort of scraping by for a lot of it. But obviously, the move that she's most known for from the season is when she finds the Chris head and is able to talk to Alejandro, claims that she's found it, but doesn't realize that Alejandro spotted her finding it. she decides to not keep it and decides to hide it. And then obviously Alejandro snatches it, steals it, plays it for himself. And then she's just all too surprised when she's voted out as a result. So obviously her hiding the Chris head after finding it, it makes really no sense if you think about it, because the Chris head can be played after the votes are read. So it's not like a normal idol where on Survivor where you have to play it after the votes are cast but before they're read. And because of that, there's a level of secrecy that you have to have involved in order to play it successfully. Like, this is literally something you can play after the votes are read. And it's honestly better if people know about it, because it basically tells the rest of the team that you are essentially untouchable, that the only way to successfully counter it is to split the vote. But even then, like, they're guaranteed to lose one of their own, and they're basically forcing themselves to have a sacrificial lamb in their place in order to counter the idol. So literally it is better for Heather to like have it on her hand and to let other people know that she has it and that she very well has the means to play for herself. So there's that. But she also is completely dumbfounded that Alejandro, the person that was right next to the spot where she found it, just happens to find it. So obviously that's another pretty bad knock as well. So again, it is a very, very bad move that ultimately cost her the game. And that's the big reason that I do knock her as much as she does for her All-Stars game. However, it is some pros in her favor, like again, her getting the votes together to save herself in the Joe round, and her just surviving until as far as she does is a big reason that she isn't lower on the list. But the move is pretty bad on its own, and it's a big reason that she's here at number 9. Now I'm moving on to number 8, and from this point on, we're all talking about people who made the merge. By number 8, we are again breaking away from the boot order, and we're actually talking about someone who made it decently further into the game, but played pretty poorly. And here we have Alejandro. And again, I feel like Alejandro is someone who I think, like, would play a somewhat decent game considering his threat level coming in. However, he was on the bottom for so much of the season. I mean, if we're looking out of his game, I mean, no, obviously he comes in the drama machine. Like, no one really knows who he is until he's ultimately broken out of it. While his legs really recover, obviously he spends the first half of the season walking on his hands, which is honestly pretty pointless if you ask me. I mean, he obviously does it because he wants Heather to feel bad for him, which is still pretty ineffective, but it's still a pretty pointless move. And plus, again, it's sort of dumb in case he ever is the reason that they lose a challenge. He is really placing a lot of his ability on not getting caught here. And again, it's just whatever. Really, though, a lot of his pre-merge is defined by him trying to get revenge on Heather, culminating at the second swap when the two of them go after each other directly. Again, not great that he's being targeted. And in fact, Heather is the one that gets a majority of votes against him. He would have gotten home if it weren't for the Chris head. Now, obviously, he is able to get the Chris head, largely because he is able to walk in on Heather finding it. He's able to sneak off. And then obviously Heather decides to not keep it for herself. I mean, again, it is all a very fluky situation where, again, Heather decides to hide this Chris head when there isn't any protection against it being stolen. So literally, Alejandro could have literally stolen it, and sure enough, plays it for himself. So even then, like, yes, he does survive the vote there, but there are still a lot of question marks over why Heather hid it and how he was able to get it for himself. Plus the fact that Heather, again, did get the majority of votes against him, so there's that. However, from the merge on, like literally from the point where he is able to save himself, everyone's pretty much targeting him. Like, he gets pretty much zero leverage in this move as the entire team turns on him. He's probably the next boot if they go back to elimination, but they don't. And again, at the merge, he's pretty much a lone wolf with no real path to the end outside of winning challenges. And he does win the first immunity, but again, that's not particularly great. I mean, Mike does approach him for an alliance, and while he accepts, he is quickly able to find out that Mike's up to no good, including Mike trying to frame him for the quote-unquote unanimous Cameron vote. Again, he needed Cameron footage to get confirmation, but at least here, he already had some suspicions, so it's not like the Noah thing from World Tour where he literally would have had no idea if he didn't see the Cameron footage, but at least here he already had some suspicions, so there's that. He does try to convince people the truth regarding Mike, but again, Mike just simply outplays him, doing work to undermine Alejandro at every opportunity, to where people don't really trust him. Plus, he makes some pretty bad social moves in the round after that, so that's not particularly great. And again, like, he is taken out shortly after as no one really trusts him. So again, Alejandro is pretty much at the bottom for a lot of the game. And yes, while he does get a one up on Heather, I mean, that does require an idle play that he probably shouldn't have been able to make. And even then, like, Heather does get literally the entire team to vote him out. And even after that, he is still at the bottom, doesn't really have much leverage moving forward. So even then, I don't really give him too much credit for that. He just isn't in that great of a position for a lot of the game, and that's a big reason that I had to knock him here. And obviously a big reason I have him here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we are finally going back now to the merge boot, and here we have Duncan. And Duncan's a weird game to talk about because he's actually in a pretty good position for a lot of it, just all things considered. I mean, yes, he does make some pretty bad moves, like he does deteriorate his relationship with Gwen over time, again, largely through his own doing, but some of that is also Gwen trying to get back with Courtney. Like, he's just completely oblivious to certain issues that Courtney is going to, as well as Gwen, to the point where Gwen breaks up with him and doesn't really have much interest in working with him moving forward. So that's not great. There's also the fact that he is starting to be perceived as this nice guy, to the point where Chris switches him from the villain scene to the heroes team. And obviously that is technically a good thing for him, because if he was able to play into this good guy perception, then maybe he could have gone further into the game. And to be his credit, like, he isn't really targeted at all during the entire pre-merge, so there's that at least. But he's just completely self-conscious about this good boy mentality. Like, he wants to be seen as a bad boy, so that's not particularly great. And the fact that he doesn't really see the benefit in being perceived as a good boy is definitely a knock to as well. Now, to his credit, he is able to pick up on Mike pretty early on. Like, he is able to recognize Mike from Juvie, so there's at least that. However, he isn't able to convince anyone about this, so that's a bit of a knock there. And then obviously we get to his boot episode, where he pretty much just sabotages his game by blowing up Chris's cottage and getting himself ejected in the process. So all that's pretty bad. And again, that's a big reason that he's this on this list. He does sabotage his game. He does let the quote unquote stigma of him being a good boy get to him, to the point where he allows himself to get ejected through blowing up the cottage. So that's not particularly great. However, there are enough pros to his game, like him having the relationship with Gwen, even though he does ruin it by the end of it. He does have some good reads with Zoe, as well as Courtney to a degree, and he wasn't going to be targeted immediately after the merge, so he was decently positioned for a lot of the game. However, he just couldn't handle it and just sabotage his game. So I can't have him too much higher, but his good position is good enough for me to have him here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and we have someone pretty similar to Duncan in the sense that they were decently positioned for a lot of it. And while they are undone by some weird circumstances, some of which was brought about them by themselves, I don't fault this person as much for their undoing. And even then, they weren't actually voted out. But here we have Cameron. And I feel like Cameron is similar to Duncan, that he was in a solid position for a lot of the game. I mean, starting out in the Heroes tribe, he had both Mike and Zoe on his side. Again, his core allies from Revenge of the Island. He also gets along with Sierra, but obviously Sierra is Sierra. It's similar to Cody. He's in a pretty strong position gameplay-wise, but he gets so fed up with Sierra that he tries to quit, which is probably a bigger knock than what I'm giving him credit for on this list. Like, obviously, the fact that he tries to quit is pretty bad, but obviously he is thwarted when he's swapped into the villain's team. That's not great. However, despite it seeming like he's at the bottom afterwards, he's able to build a relationship with Gwen, and with there being bigger threats in Heather and Alejandro, he does have some breathing room there. Despite losing Heather, he's finally given the chance to eliminate a hero after winning the following challenge. And while it isn't great that he allows Sierra to go, I mean, at least I understand it a bit more. I mean, Sierra was much more unhinged at this point than in World Tour. And unlike Cody, I feel like Cameron had more allies moving forward as well. And plus, considering that Sierra was the reason that he wanted to quit, obviously I understand it from the sense that he had to get someone like that out in order for him to continue. So at least there's that. And then we get to the merge, where Obviously, Mike, he is able to reconnect with both Mike and Zoe, but then Mike turns on him for whatever reason. Now, I kind of get it in the sense that Cameron was the one that picked up on Mike's DID from Revenge of the Island, but considering Cameron is someone that hasn't picked up on Mike's new personality and is someone that's still loyal to him, it is questionable on Mike's end. Now, I do fault Cameron a little bit for being targeted at all. However, I feel like he doesn't do that much wrong to be targeted by Mike, as it just feels like Malice is being evil on his own. Obviously, Mike tries rigging the votes to have him eliminated quote unquote unanimously, only for the Duncan ejection to get in the way. And while Mike continues to manipulate him and get into his head, Cameron doesn't realize that Mike is the one behind it all, which is a knock. Like, he is sort of led to the belief that other people are turning on him and that Mike is simply the communicator of the information rather than the one contributing to it. And a lot of his Buddha episode has him going on this downward spiral. Like, he's told Gwen has turned on him. He's told he needs to break up Scott and Courtney to secure Scott's loyalty. Alejandro tries helping him during the challenge, only to refuse. And eventually he is injured to the point where he's medevaced. So that does benefit his game a little bit in the sense that he is never voted out. He is technically medevaced at the end of the day. However, it is the knock that Mike does target him that leads to his downfall at the end. So I feel like Cameron definitely has fewer faults than Duncan. I mean, yes, outside of him trying to quit, I mean, he is in a solid position and he doesn't do that much actively wrong in the game. It's just a matter of Mike turning on him for reasons that Cameron doesn't really contribute, at least in the context of this season. I feel like it's more so driven by what he did in Revenge of the Island that's getting him targeted by Mike. And obviously, he is eventually taken out of the game. So I can't have him at the very top, but it is good enough to have him here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and I can't believe this person is this high. I didn't want to put this person this high, kind of like with Heather, but given the rest of the field, I don't really have much of a choice. But here we have Courtney. And I feel like Courtney played a pretty mediocre game, if you ask me. She obviously has a pretty rough start, being in the bottom 2 at the first elimination ceremony and just getting on a lot of people's nerves. And in fact, it eventually gets to the point where Chris puts her on the villains team for not acting heroic enough, so there's that. We also have Gwen trying to get her forgiveness for the love triangle situation, which she rejects for a lot of the first half. I mean, she even tries making a deal with Heather to vote out Gwen, but upon realizing Gwen's intentions are pure, she starts to soften up a bit. Like this, along with a budding relationship with Scott, gives her 2 allies moving forward. So, I mean, she was at least decently positioned in the pre-merge. But then we get to the merge where, again, she is in an alright position, generally being in the majority for a lot of those votes. Mike persuades Cameron to kiss her, which throws a wrench in her relationship with Scott, although they are able to smooth things over with Scott shortly afterwards. The incident also haunts her relationship with Gwen due to the hypocrisy she displays in his brushing the kiss aside. Again, she is able to smooth things over, but again, pretty rough patch. But then we get to the final 5, where coming in, she does have an endgame plan of taking Scott to the final 2, thinking he would throw away his game to her. And while Scott throwing away the game was a questionable assumption, the plan itself was somewhat realistic, especially if she was able to keep Gwen and Scott on her side and vote out Mike and Scott back to back. But she makes one of the most boneheaded decisions I've ever seen, where the plan was so apparently too complicated for her to keep in her head, so she decides to leave a paper trail for anyone to find. Sure enough, Mike finds it and leaks it to everyone, thus blowing up her spot. Now, obviously, the fact that she made it so easy for her plan to be exposed is terrible, but I also fault her for failing to convince Gwen and Scott to not take the shot at Mike and Zoe even after the information comes out, as doing so would have been in their best interest. Like, while she still would have had no path to the end outside winning challenges, she's unable to convince them to keep an eye on the clear power duo in the game at that point, voting her out instead and leaving them in a worse position. So obviously the final 5 is a big knock for her. It's really one of the most mind-boggling decisions I've ever seen. But she was at least in a decent position for decent chunks of the game, even if she made some mistakes along the way, even if she rubbed some people the wrong way along the way. But it's not really enough to completely knock her down, but that final 5 round is just so bad that I can't reward her too much. So she's here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4. And for me, it was pretty close between these next 2. However, I feel like this person did more actively wrong in the end game to allow them to end up where they are. But in number 4, we do have Scott. And I feel like Scott played a okay game for the most part. However, I feel like he does kind of drop the ball towards the end. And again, he is in a somewhat decent position for a good chunk of the pre-merge. I mean, he does go to Boney Island twice, thinking he can get the Chris head there, but obviously he is never able to get it. He obviously builds his relationship with Courtney to the point where it becomes a showmance, and obviously that's something at least is never in too much danger throughout a lot of the game. Like, he's never in the bottom two at any point, so there's that at least. Coming to the merge, I mean, he is in the majority for the most part. I mean, with his relationship with Courtney, although he allows himself to believe that Courtney and Cameron were kissing when it was so obviously an accident, but this just is what it is. However, they are able to get back together shortly thereafter. However, I do think the faults come starting at the final 5, really, where obviously the whole Courtney thing comes into play with everyone finding out about her endgame plan. And he's mad at it too, even though he technically benefits the most from it, where Courtney is planning to take him to the final 2. And yes, well, that's because she assumes he would just throw away his game for her. Like, that's the perfect position for him to be in. Like, because even if that they got down to it, I mean, Courtney would be under the assumption that Scott wouldn't try that hard in the final challenge, but that's just the perfect thing for him to do, to really try and win when Courtney has her guard down. So really, that's a great position for him to be in, but he just fails to recognize it and just gets mad along with everyone else. Now, you could say that some of this was for show, as obviously everyone else was mad at it because it obviously doesn't involve him. So obviously it'd be a bad look for him to be the only one happy about it because, again, he is the only one that benefits from it. So again, I understand from that end, but he still votes out Courtney at the end. Like, that's not ideal. So again, he pretty much just allows Courtney to go there at Final 5, someone who was actively willing to take him to the end in a position where he arguably has the advantage coming in. So that's not particularly great. And I already mentioned this earlier, but even for everyone else, like, he could have easily convinced the others that Mike and Zoe were the bigger threat, which they were. But again, he just allowed the attention to stick onto Courtney there. And then the final 4, like, we see him like trying to getting roped into an alliance by Gwen in order to break up Mike, but then Mike literally talks him out of it, which is pretty bad as well. And then obviously he's voted out shortly thereafter, where Gwen is ejected, and then he goes out immediately after. So it's a pretty rough endgame, all things considered. I feel like both the Final 5 and Final 4 rounds has some pretty bad elements to them. However, he did play a solid game before that, so I do at least give him credit for that. However, it's just the way he handles the endgame and just completely drops the ball, not only in letting everyone vote out Courtney over Mike or Zoe, but then at the Final 4, just him being talked out of the alliance to take out Mike, and then obviously having no means of saving himself. So those are big enough knocks to have him below the next person we'll be talking about, and he's here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and we have someone pretty similar to Scott. Arguably a rougher game before the end game, but someone that does less actively wrong there in the end game. And here we have Gwen. And I do think Gwen played the better game between her and Scott. Granted, I feel like she was obviously in a worse position for more of the game than Scott, but makes less mistakes throughout. So she obviously starts on the villain's team, where despite coming in with a bad reputation, she is helped by Duncan being on her team and Courtney being on the heroes. She integrates pretty nicely. She obviously gets through the lightning vote without too much trouble. While Heather and Joe attempt to get her on their side in an effort to gain Duncan, she sees through it and sides with Alejandro to blindside Joe. That's something. Courtney then joins her team, someone she's been trying to get forgiveness from, although she isn't on board initially. While Courtney gets Heather to agree to target Gwen next, it's clear Heather wouldn't have gone through with that, plus they win the next challenge anyway, but over time, she's able to mend things over with Courtney. Granted, a big piece of that is her breaking up with Duncan, which isn't ideal, but considering they are on opposite teams by that point, it isn't the worst thing in the world. She is part of the plan to blindside Alejandro, only for Alejandro to play the idol. She then has a hand in eliminating Sierra, someone Cameron was annoyed by, which, okay. At the merge, she has distanced herself from Duncan and even laughs off his insistence that Mike is a threat, which isn't ideal. But considering what happens to Duncan afterwards, it's probably for the best. I mean, Duncan wasn't long for the game afterwards anyways, so there's that. But then Mike just simply outplays her, convincing Cameron into thinking she's going to flip on him, despite being one of her closer allies. Cameron is taken out of the game before they can really reconnect, which isn't great. After that, she ignores Alejandro's warning about Mike and later agrees to vote him out, which isn't in her best interest. Obviously, that's not great. Then went the final five, where she finds out that Courtney was planning to take Scott to the end over her. And while she and everyone else is upset about this, I don't think it was in her best interest to vote out Courtney at 5. And again, I feel the same way about Scott as well. However, I feel like Gwen at least had more justification to vote out Courtney there, as, again, she wasn't being taken to the end. Again, I still think it's the wrong move, but I feel like I fault Gwen less for voting out Courtney here than I do with Scott, someone who literally threw away a guaranteed final 2 in order to keep around Mike and Zoe. So there's that. Obviously, in Gwen's case, she is in a worse position at the final 4, where her only real shot of getting to the end is turning Zoe against Mike. And while she does make some efforts to do so, she ultimately loses the challenge and is eliminated automatically. So there's that at least. So I feel like Gwen is definitely a rockier game throughout, and I can see the debate for her being lower than Scott. However, the main reason I have her above Scott is because I feel like her mistakes in the end game, while bad, aren't as bad for her as they are for other people. Like her voting out Courtney at the final 5, like, yes, while it is bad for her position, I mean, I feel like it was a worse decision for Scott. As I explained earlier, like Scott benefited from Courtney's endgame plan and was still going to be in a bad position coming to Final Four anyway. So, all things considered, I feel like it's worse for Scott than it is for Gwen. And I feel like Gwen actively did more at the Final Four to try to position herself better, whereas Scott, I feel like, was more willing to go along with what Mike wanted. So, that's a pretty big knock as well. And yes, while she doesn't believe the whole Mal situation, I mean, I feel like that's the case for a lot of people in this game, and obviously that's a pretty big knock for a lot of people in general. So I feel like I can't fault Gwen too much specifically for that. So on the whole, I mean, I feel like Gwen played a pretty good game given her circumstances. Like, yes, she was in a worse position than Scott throwing out a lot of it, but she is able to recover somewhat nicely. And I feel like her mistakes in the end game aren't as bad as some other people. So because of that, I have her here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2. And again, it's a pretty clear top 2. It's the final 2, in fact. It's just a matter of the order. And it's a pretty clear order for me. Pretty clear number 2. Pretty clear number 1. But here at number 2, we do have Zoe. And again, Zoe played a good game for the most part. Now, obviously, she gets a decent amount of flack for not picking up on Mike not being Mike for the longest time. Like, despite multiple people warning her, like Duncan warns her, Alejandro tries warning her, even some other people try giving her hints along the way, but she just takes so long to pick up on it. And obviously, it's only like at the final 2, really, that she really figures it out. So there's that issue at least, and that is a knock against her. But I feel like that's a knock with some other people we talked about earlier, so there's that at least. Plus, those other people got outplayed by Mike in a position where, I mean, Mike didn't want to take him to the end. Like, Mike at least wanted to take Zoe to the end, so at the end of the day, it was still in Zoe's best interest to stay aligned with Mike as long as she did, even though she doesn't recognize that Mike is, like, being pretty duplicitous with everyone else. So, yeah, like a lot of her game is just her being aligned with Mike, and she is in the majority for the most of it. Like, granted, she doesn't make too many decisions on her own. Like, I feel like a lot of it is her and Mike working together. However, again, it was in her best interest to stay aligned with Mike. We then get to the final 5, where, again, the whole endgame plan is revealed. Now, she was planning to be voted out there. Like, Courtney didn't want to take Zoe to the end, obviously, and granted, she didn't want to take Mike either. However, Mike was the one to ultimately find the paper trail and expose it to everyone. As I feel like if Zoe didn't know about that, she probably would have still tried trusting Courtney moving forward. So I do give Mike more credit for that than Zoe per se. And I mean, there isn't really too much to say about Zoe's game aside from that. I mean, she is able to win immunity at the final five, like is able to get out the bottom there. At final four, she wins immunity again, like votes out Scott there in his guaranteed final two after Gwen is ejected. And while the Gwen ejection was beneficial to both Mike and Zoe, the thing I'll credit Zoe over Mike is that she was at least better positioned in that final three, whereas I feel like Gwen would have taken Zoe to the end had it been a natural final three over Mike. So that's pretty much the main pro I can give Zoe over Mike, is that she was at least better positioned in the end game. However, I feel like Mike just simply did more of the legwork from more of the game than her, and that's a big reason that I have her here at number two. Now, it's still a pretty impressive game on the whole. Like, she is in the majority for the whole game. She's never in the bottom two at any point, and she is pretty well liked and pretty well positioned to where multiple people want to work with her. However, I feel like the number one person clearly outplayed her at multiple opportunities, and that's a big reason I have Zoe here at number two. Now, at number one, the player I think played the best game on Total Drama All Stars is Mike. Now, I know I got some flack for this pick on my winner ranking, as I had Mike number one on my winner ranking, and I decided to disregard the whole Mal situation, at least for the player ranking. And I still stand by that. Like, I feel like in general, Mike is such a weird anomaly to talk about. Like, how much of it is Mike, how much of it is all of his other personalities. However, for this list, at least for these lists where I'm assessing games, I feel like it's just easier to talk about Mike as one person, all of the personalities as one entity. Whereas I feel like on a player ranking, I feel like those would definitely come into play more. But for this list where I'm just looking at the games, I'm going to be considering Mal and Mike to essentially be the same person here. And through that, we see a pretty dominant game for the most part. And now, obviously, there are some holes in the game. Like, I feel like he does a bit too much in the terms of evil for the sake of being evil. Granted, it's not as bad as Alejandro, where he would literally just align with people just to immediately backstab them. Like, Mike was a bit more petty in terms of what he did. Like, he would just break people's belongings, steal them. And for whatever reason, he did it in a way where he got caught on camera, so that's not great. Obviously, that's not ideal either. I feel like the closest he comes to just not doing good strategically is when he's handling Cameron. Like, I feel like the way he turns on Cameron for seemingly no reason is pretty dumb in my opinion, especially when Cameron didn't seem to be picking up on Mal taking over. I feel like it was just a pretty unnecessary move, if you ask me, just to obviously have the unanimous vote against him, followed by continuing to just feed into his paranoia to the point where he loses his mind by the end. So I do fault him a bit for the Cameron move. However, I feel like everything else is pretty strong. Like, he is in the majority for most of the game. He has his core alliance. Granted, it's a lot of his allies from Revenge of the Island, but he is able to control a lot of the game by taking out some easy targets along the way. And while people like Duncan and Alejandro start to pick up on Mal being Mal, he's able to get them out in relatively quick fashion. Now, granted, the Duncan thing was out of his control, but he is able to successfully turn most of the team against Alejandro to where they don't believe him even after he starts to pick up on his game, even though Alejandro literally had a DVD of all the bad stuff that he did, which why? But it is something at least. He's able to drive a wedge between Courtney and Scott, at least temporarily, and he is able to expose Courtney's plan at the final five of her endgame, which obviously did not benefit him or Zoe. He's able to turn the entire team against Courtney, even including Scott, someone who benefited directly from the plan. And obviously, they're able to vote out Courtney at 4. Now, as I mentioned with Zoe, I do think the biggest knock against him is that he is poorly positioned if it were a natural final 3. I feel like in the final 3 of him, Gwen, and Zoe, that he would have essentially needed to win final immunity, or really, it's not even that bad of a position. He just needed Gwen to not win final immunity. But obviously, Gwen gets ejected due to the nature of the Final 4 challenge, so he's able to avoid that entirely and gets to his ideal Final 2 of him and Zoe. And I feel like that is pretty impressive, the fact that he does have control from pretty much beginning to end. And I know that, like, obviously people compare this game a lot to Alejandro, And I know people were so mad at my winner ranking that I put Alejandro so low on it due to the being voted out situation. And to be fair, I feel like if Alejandro was never voted out at the Final Four, he probably does edge out Mike here. However, even then, like I feel like Mike makes fewer mistakes, or at least fewer mistakes that matter within the game. Like I still do think that him breaking all the stuff and allowing that to be captured on camera is a bit much. Like it's a bit too much of evil to be evil. Whereas I feel like Alejandro did more evil to be evil stuff that mattered within the game, such as building allies and immediately backstabbing them. So there's that to consider. But I still think Mike played a pretty solid winning game on All Stars. Again, obviously the big caveat being that quote unquote real Mike wasn't in control for about half of it. But again, that doesn't really matter that much when I'm talking about the games, because I consider Mike to be one person doing stuff entirely on his own. So I feel like that doesn't really matter too much on a game ranking. And if we're just looking at the game, he clearly dominates the game. And I feel like he doesn't have the downsides that someone like Alejandro does have, to the point where I would have him higher in a winner ranking. So those are all big things in his favor. And while it's not a perfect game, I feel like it is good enough to easily be number one on this player ranking. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now, obviously, I have one season left of this to do, that being Pacoteo Island. And then afterwards, I do plan to do an overall player ranking, where I'm basically just assessing everyone that's ever played this game as a player. So that should be very fun. Probably going to be a very long video, but I mean, I'm willing to take that on. Obviously, I have more content like this coming in the future, and I always plug this at the end of these whole drama videos. But if you do like this content in particular, I do have a second channel, Survivor Gumball, where I talk about Survivor, Big Brother, other reality shows similar to Total Drama, and I do talk about strategy and all that other stuff. So if you like this content, be sure to check out that channel. But for now, that is the video. See ya.